Greetings fellow makers, welcome down to the shop. I'm Bill and today I'm going to show you how Brittany and I made the horned steel helmet from Skyrim. This video is part of a series. Our friends over at Bethesda came to us to help spread the word about the special edition release of Skyrim coming out on October 28th. They wanted us to help you guys learn how to build some of the most epic and awesome armor and costume pieces from Skyrim, and today we're building this helmet. I'm going to break down every single step we took to build this thing, and down in the description you will find links to all of the materials that we used as well as some free blueprints. Alright, let's get started. Originally, Brittany built the pattern of this thing off of a bust of my head, this one right here. Now our prototype helmet here ended up being a little bit bigger than we had anticipated, but there are a couple of different sized patterns in the download that you can use. My head is about 23 inches in circumference, and the small size template that we have in the download, that's this guy right here, actually fits me pretty well. It's rather snug. If you have a head bigger than mine, then you might want to go with the bigger template, but most people can go with the small size template in the download and be in good shape. The template was printed out, then taped together, and then cut out. Take the time to cut out all the hash marks too. These will make assembly much easier later. These templates were traced onto floor mat foam using a Sharpie. If there were any bubbles, we made sure to avoid them. Then all of the parts were cut out using a very sharp knife. The more patient you are with this part, the better the helmet will turn out. So take your time and be sure to keep your knife nice and sharp. If some of the edges are a little bit rough, don't worry, they can be cleaned up with the sanding drum and a rotary tool. This particular helmet has a lot of really interesting inlaid patterns on most of the parts. The inlay shapes were trimmed out of the template and then traced onto the already cut out foam parts. These were then carefully cut out from the helmet. Again, take your time here. It's important that these cuts are made at a right angle to the surface of the foam mat. These parts can then be pushed into the surface to create another level of detail. But before gluing them in place, we added a little bit of texture. We found a quick way to get it pretty close. Using a meat tenderizer, yes, you heard me. We heated up the foam and then pressed in the bumpy side of the kitchen tool to create the texture. By pressing it in really hard, it left a super neat texture in the foam. This was repeated over all of the inlay parts until they were all covered with those dimples. Note that reheating the foam will make the texture disappear, so you can try again if you mess up, but also you may need to redo some of the parts and work in small batches in overlapping areas. These inlay pieces were then pressed back into their original parts. Using a 6mm piece of craft foam as a spacer, the parts were pushed in to the identical depth. Then they were hot glued in place from the back. Once that was all cooled, the protruding foam was trimmed flush to the back of the floor mat foam. The squiggly details on the inlays were done next, all cut from 2mm craft foam. Using the templates as a guide, we traced the pattern onto the foam and cut them all out, all those tiny pieces, with an X-Acto knife. This is, of course, incredibly tedious, but these little details really make the helmet stand out. These little parts were then carefully placed into their respective inlays and glued down using super glue. This process was repeated over all of the helmet parts. Using a grinding bit on the rotary tool, all of the inner edges were then smoothed over. The head spike was done in a similar fashion, but we used 3 different thicknesses of foam, 6, 4, and 2mm. The pattern was traced onto the 4mm foam and the inlay areas were trimmed out, but not the outer edges, not yet. The meat tenderizer was used to put the pattern onto the 6mm foam, and then contact cement was brushed onto the surface of that and onto the back of the previous piece. Then, when that was dry, the 2 parts were pressed together and we could finally cut them out. They were cut out using a sharp knife at a 45-degree angle bevel along the outer edge, cutting inward. Of course, if you have it, a bandsaw is super awesome for doing this kind of work, but not entirely necessary. A V groove shaped cut was made in the back of these pieces to make a crease for the part to bend. We made 4 of these pieces and then brushed contact cement onto the back beveled edges. Once dry, we could assemble all of the parts slowly and carefully, forming the spike. All of the squiggly bits were cut out of 2mm foam and super glued into place just like we did on the rest of the helmet. All of the edges were then smoothed over with a grinding bit on the rotary tool. Some parts, like the nose, needed a crease in them, so we trimmed out a V-shaped groove again in the back, and then we laid down some super glue and pressed the parts together. From the front, this adds a nice looking ridge. The opposite was done on the cheek parts. A V groove was cut, but then a wedge of foam was hot glued in place to spread the part out. From the front, this created a crease in the opposite direction. Any edges that weren't going to be glued together were then rounded over using a sanding drum. Before gluing all the parts together, we heated them up a little bit and formed them by hand the best we could. But remember, if you heat up the pieces with that meat tenderizer texture on them, it'll make the texture go away. So be gentle with your heat application. Then all of the edges were glued up using contact cement. We used the letters on the template to figure out which edges lined up with one another. And remember that all of the edges with those hash marks on them will be joined, so those are the ones that need some of your contact cement. We carefully brushed glue on all the edges and let it dry for 5 to 10 minutes. Once the parts were all dry, they were pressed together using the hash marks to ensure everything went together properly. This is another part where patience pays off. The more carefully you press the parts together, the cleaner your seams will be. All of the main helmet pieces were done first, creating the base helmet form. Then the 3 front face parts were glued to one another. Once they were set, they were glued to the front of the helmet. The bases of the horn were left separate for just a moment to add a tiny bit more detail. A line was scored into the surface with a sharp X-Acto knife, and then we hit it with a heat gun to make that line open up. Then those pieces were hot glued to the helmet. To support the shape of the helm, more grooves were cut into the back and hot glued into place. We also cut out some strips of styrene plastic to act as braces for the back of some of the foam parts. This plastic was heated and bent into shape. Once it was sanded, it was then super glued onto the back of the foam helmet. It did make those cheek pieces a little bit more rigid. The remaining detail of the helmet was done as additional layers of 2mm craft foam added to the surface of the base form. These were cut out in thick strips using a ruler. Dots were measured out along the length of these strips to mark out where there would be faux rivets. Using the end of a sanding drum, these rivets were carved into the foam strips using that rotary tool. They actually match up with the reference image almost perfectly. These detail strips were then glued down to the helmet using more super glue. They were added all around the helmet in appropriate places and trimmed to butt up against one another. Grooves were cut into these detail strips on the top to make room for the top spike, and then that little fella was super glued in place. The horns were not made from EVA foam. Instead, we used EPS, aka insulation foam. The template was used to figure out the rough size of the horn, and then a couple layers of 2-inch thick foam were cut out and glued together using a spray adhesive. Weights were used to squish the layers together as they dried. The top horn shape was traced onto those bricks of foam, and then the base was cut off as squarely as possible. This allowed me to transfer the shape to the other side of the foam. With the template on both sides, the rough shape could be carefully cut out using a coping saw. Again, if you have a bandsaw, it makes this part way easier. A rough taper was cut into the top and bottom of the foam to start shaping it. Then, using the lines on the cutting mat, a 30-degree angle was cut off the base of the horn. This is so the horn would tilt down a little bit when attached to the helmet. Then, a circle was traced onto the base where it would socket into the helmet. The initial shaping was all done with a sharp knife. It's very important that the knife stay sharpened during this process because this foam really likes to tear. This sculpting was done carefully and deliberately to try and get the bumps and grooves of the horn to look right. The final shaping was done with a rotary tool and a rough sanding drum. Now this tool removes material with great efficiency, so use a gentle hand. Care was taken to not remove too much material, and I carefully brought the surface down to its final form. The last bit of sculpting was done with a 100 grit sandpaper. When I was happy with the form, the horns were sealed using 3 or 4 good layers of wood glue. We brushed on 3 layers, let them dry between each application, then sanded the surface a bit and added 1 more good layer. This helmet also has a little bit of chainmail on the back. You can buy pre-made sheets of chainmail, or you can buy your own rings and weave it yourself. Or, keeping with the kitchen theme, you can also buy a small sheet of chainmail that's used for washing cast iron pans. Yes, really. We opted to make our own chainmail using a PVC pipe. If you're going this route, be sure to sand it first for painting later. Then you can cut out little rings of PVC using a PVC cutter, individually, one ring at a time. This is tedious, but it is cheap and it works. Or you can use a bandsaw and a fence to cut out a bunch all at once. I went with a 4-in-1 European pattern for my chainmail, and there are loads of better chainmail tutorials out there, so I'm not going to dive into the specifics, but I made a board to hang all my rings from, and I put it together one link at a time. The rings were cut open with some nippers to link them all together by hand. There was no need to glue them back closed, since this part wouldn't be holding any weight. Once I was done with the giant row of chainmail, the links were zip tied to a strip of nylon webbing to attach them to the helmet later. Finally, it was time to paint the helmet. The finishing and painting for this helmet was done completely with acrylic paints. No sealing needed. These Angelus acrylic leather paints are really nice and flexible, perfect for painting foam. The base coat on the helmet was a couple good layers of brushed on black paint. The next layer was brushed with a dark pewter. This was done just a little at a time with a large, rough chip brush. The goal here was to add some texture and just a hint of metallic sheen to the surface. After that, a layer of brown was ever so gently brushed over the top to warm things up a little bit. This was done with an almost entirely dry brush, and there was a focus on the grooves and crevices, any deep areas that would accumulate dirt. That base coat of color was then sealed with a clear matte spray varnish and allowed to dry. Then a lighter silver layer of paint was brushed on. Again, this didn't cover everything, mostly it brought out the edges and highlights as well as added even more texture. The horns were also painted with acrylic paints, starting with a brushed on base coat of brown. The next step was a lighter cream color applied with the sponge to create all kinds of texture. After that, a slightly darker cream color was applied to all of the horns except for the high ridges. Then a more dark brown was added to the lower spots. Once finished, the paint job was all sealed using more of that spray varnish. The chainmail was painted in a similar way as the rest of the armor, although it was base coated with a rattle can. This is a spray paint meant for plastic. Several layers were applied to make sure that all of the links were covered, and then the remaining exposed bits were touched up with a little bit of black acrylic paint. The rest of the metallic paints were applied just like the rest of the helmet, with a darker pewter color and then a brighter silver to add a little bit of texture and highlights. Finally, we were ready to put this whole thing together. The chainmail was hot glued into the inside of the helmet using that nylon webbing strap that we attached earlier. The horns were plugged into the holes on the side of the helmet. Those were also hot glued into place. The last touch was to cut out some squishy foam to add a little bit of padding to the inside of the helmet. These, again, were hot glued into place, creating a really good snug fit on my head.
Just holding the hot glue.
Where's your can of compressed air?
There's no more compressed air. We used it all.
And that was it! The horned steel helmet is completed! Now my head will be safe from draugrs, dragons, and trolls. Speaking of draugrs, I've been reminiscing about the Draugr Deathlord costumes that Brittany and I made a couple of years ago. If you have your own Skyrim memories to share, post them online using the hashtag Skyrim Memories. And look for more Skyrim tutorials coming at you in the next couple of weeks as we march closer to October 28th and the release of Skyrim Special Edition. I really do hope you guys give this build a try. Like I said, the templates are down in the description. Grab them, grab some foam, start cutting, and build your own steel helmet. Thank you so much for checking out the video. If you have any questions about this build, let me know in the comments down below, and I will try to get back to every one of you. And last week's build was Wuthrad, the legendary two-handed axe. So if you haven't checked out that video yet, well, there will be a link right there. Head on over and give that one a look. Everything else you need to know about making props and costumes from foam can be found at punishprops.com/foamsmithing. And of course, if you're new to the channel, then head on down to the subscribe button and give it a push. We've got more videos, including 3 more armor making videos from Skyrim coming at you in the next couple of weeks. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in Riften. Perfect.